Well, thank you very much, Anna, for those kind words. And also, I want to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for the support throughout my academic career they have been giving to my projects. And currently, I'm doing an end of Cold War project, studying the end of the Cold War at Duke University with Carnegie support. So thank you very much. I was able to do the books that I've written and other things in many ways because of that support. I think it's very important that Anna has organized this study group. Probably there is no subject that right now is more central to the security future of our country than our relations with Russia. It doesn't mean that US and Russia are going to run the world or ever have, but it does mean as the two largest nuclear powers, we bear a special responsibility, and the first responsibility is to cooperate. I'm often asked, how did you get interested in Russia? And I would have to say, in part at least, and maybe not in large part, but at least halfway, because of nuclear weapons. The first nuclear weapon was dropped about the time I was graduating from high school. And my wife and I, we were both students at Duke University in those years just after World War II, were convinced that if we didn't have a world government, these new weapons were going to destroy humanity. As we learned, and we were both active in what was called then United World Federalists, as we learned more about the world and maybe about human nature, we decided, well, not only is there not going to be a world government, but there probably shouldn't be. Could be a dangerous thing for humanity. But that meant that if we were going to control these nuclear weapons, we had to have peaceful relations with the other nuclear powers. And that meant that at that time, we had to negotiate with the Soviet Union. At the same time, as an undergraduate, I became more and more interested in Russian culture. For some reason, I don't even know now, I picked up a translation of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment when I was a freshman. It wasn't assigned to me, it was one of these things, picked up, started reading, it bowled me over. And I wanted to learn more and more about Russian culture that had produced, increasingly as I read other writers of the 19th and early 20th century, this remarkable culture, remarkable literature. So eventually I decided that I would really like either to do college teaching, teaching about Russia and Russian culture, or the Foreign Service and dealing more directly with what we considered the basic issue of nuclear weapons. I've been a very fortunate person in that in the rest of my life I've been able to do both. 35 years in the Foreign Service and now almost that long in various gigs in academia. And I think behind all of this is the strong feeling that the creation of nuclear weapons began a new era in the history of humanity. Before then, wars could create a lot of destruction, a lot of misery, very rarely anything positive. But in a nuclear age, with the quantity of nuclear weapons that the US and Russia possess today, humanity will not survive, certainly civilization will not survive if they are used. So clearly, we have to keep this foremost in mind. Now, when President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, then General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, met for the first time in November 1985, they came to a very important agreement, as it turned out. At the time, not too many people noticed. but they agreed on the following proposition: a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and that means there can be no war between us. Well, you know, people have said, oh, that's just rhetoric. But then when Secretary of State George Shultz went to the Soviet leaders and would point out to them what they were spending on the military, what we were spending on the military, and say, look, that's crazy. We're not going to fight each other. Why are we doing this? We're robbing our people of these resources. And in their memoirs, both Gorbachev and the then Prime Minister Ryzhkov said this was the most powerful argument, and once they were convinced that we really meant it, this was the basis that within 3 years we were able not only to end the arms race, but to end the Cold War altogether. But we ended it not by conquering anybody. We ended it by negotiation. And although people look back now and talk about, well, you know, we won the Cold War, we brought down the Soviet Union, the Russians think so too, in many cases. But the fact is that everything we negotiated with the Soviet Union was at least as much in the interest of the Soviet Union as it was in the United States. Maybe more so, because they were hurting more from that arms race. Now, where are we today? We're back in what would seem to be another Cold War with Russia. Now, back during the, you might say, the classical Cold War, the one before, there was a real basic ideological difference between us. The Soviet Union was based on Marxist theory and was based upon the idea that there would be a proletarian revolution against the so-called bourgeois governments, which would result in a world of socialism, which would gradually, or maybe rapidly, Marx was not clear about this, develop into a communist society where all were equal. That was the antithesis, of course, of our own political. So the geopolitical competition, the arms race, grew out of that very fundamental ideological split. Today, there is no fundamental ideological split between the US and Russia. And the fact is, though we have greatly reduced the nuclear weapons we had during the Cold War, at one point during the Cold War, both countries combined had 60,000. You know, some scientists said, you know, if all of these are used, it'll destroy the civilization 7 times over. And others said, no, 20 times. And others would say, well, but once you've done it once, what's the point in doing it again? Now, of course, we were both building them not because we planned to use them, but because we were afraid if the other side got a little more than we did, they would derive some political advantage somewhere in the world. Well, it was precisely the recognition by both our leaders that the weapons themselves are a threat that enabled us with, I would say, the active cooperation of a fairly small number of people in both governments to bring close to an end to the idiocy of that Cold War. But now we have no ideological reason, no ideological basis for considering Russia an enemy. And yet, recently, within the last few months, I understand the American commander of NATO has called Russia an enemy and has said, you know, Russia is an existential threat to the United States. Well, if all their weapons are used against us, yes. They are an existential threat. In that sense, what the NATO commander didn't say is the United States, with its nuclear weapons, is an existential threat to every country in the world, and indeed collectively to all. Does that make us enemies? No. That is the basic requirement where we must not allow ourselves to think of each other as enemies, and following the agreement that Gorbachev and Reagan made in 1986. A nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, therefore there can be no war between us. If there can be no war between us, why are we sending American troops into Eastern Europe near the Russian border? Why? Makes no sense. Okay. Where shall we start today? Let's start with the present. Right now, Washington and our entire, certainly legislative and executive branch, seems to be in the throes of something that appears to me as near insanity. This thing about Russia's supposed interference in our elections. Now, I want to talk about that first, and then let's go back and look at how we actually ended the other Cold War, and then what we did wrong after that. Now, Trump's election in Russia. First of all, and I'll quote more from it, I have actually read the intelligence report issued in January about so-called Russian interference in the election, and I'll have some words about it. But the first question is, did people in the Russian government want Trump to win? And I would say, sure. After all, you know, one of our two candidates had called the president of Russia a thug, an aggressor, even compared him to Hitler. The other said, I think it's better to cooperate with Russia than not. You don't have to ask our intelligence agencies whether a government is going to favor one or the other. Ask a 5-year-old. Say, you know, suppose you're the president of a big country, and then there's an election in an even bigger country, and one candidate says he wants to cooperate, the other candidate says she thinks you're a tyrant and an enemy. Which one are you going to favor? Maybe you don't have to be 5 years old. I suspect a 4-year-old can answer that one. So, and you know, basically much of this report is saying, well, there was a lot of evidence that they favored Trump. Another thing the report says, which is consistent with my own understanding, is they didn't expect him to win. Now, the report also goes into a lot of detail of what it considers high confidence, though not certainty, that not only, well, it's pretty clear that a Russian group of hackers hacked the DNC and John Podesta's emails. So these are guys that anybody can hire. But without any real evidence, and maybe the evidence they had was so classified they couldn't give it, they think the Russian government ordered a campaign, and even perhaps Trump personally, to affect our democracy. Well, I think it is extraordinarily unlikely that those hacked emails or John Podesta's had any effect whatsoever on the way people voted. I can't think of anybody who voted for Trump because the DNC was stacking things for Hillary Clinton. I mean, the idea that somehow they would, I find really quite strange. Another thing in this report, however, by the intelligence agencies is that those hacked emails, there's no evidence that any of them were false. So whoever did it exposed the truth. So when people say these activities somehow harmed our democracy or interfered in our election, I say, now wait a minute, think about what you're saying. You're saying that making public what the Democratic National Committee was doing was damaging to democracy. I thought that transparency was pretty important to democracy. I even learned that the truth will make you free. But in effect, they're saying, well, the truth damaged our democracy. Well, and I would say for those Republicans that are now in the Senate voting to sanction Russia because of its interference in our election, now wait a minute. You are sanctioning them because they allegedly did something to help elect your candidate? I mean, it wasn't the Russians that nominated him, it was you. I mean, it was you, the Republican Party. My goodness. Well, okay. Did Vladimir Putin order the hacking? Well, I said, you know, I don't think you can prove it. Probably. So what? Didn't both Clinton and Obama insult him publicly and repeatedly? So, you know, why shouldn't he give an order? Did the hacking support the truth or obscure it? It supported the truth. Now, if it had been done by a Sanders supporter, he or she would be praised for as a whistleblower. And then the idea is, how could the Russians interfere in our elections? That's just simply immoral. Well, first of all, you're assuming they interfered, which I don't think is proven at all. But wait a minute. Don't we interfere in elections? Sometimes much more directly than this. Any time in any foreign election, we see some coming up and we think that one candidate is more favorable to our interests than another. We're going to make political decisions that we think are going to help that candidate. And you know, not too rarely, we get indirectly involved in very direct support for a candidate, and this was particularly true in the 1996 Russian elections. The ones that Boris Yeltsin went into with about 8 or 9% favorable. The Communist Party at that time was pulling nearly 40%. We considered it very important, and it was very important to our interest that Yeltsin win that election. And we did everything in our power to help, including most likely, though I don't know this for a fact, rather massive amounts of money. And advisors active in campaigns. The point is, we and other countries do it all the time. And if you want to look at foreign countries that routinely interfere in our elections, look at Israel. But, you know, that's another story. But somehow the idea that there's something immoral with trying to influence other countries' elections, I find pretty naive. Now, what's the bottom line of this as far as I would concern? First of all, Trump won without any help from Russia. How did he win? There is a very, I think, important article, if you're really interested, in a balanced view of how he won, an article in the latest Political Science Quarterly by Professor Gary Jacobson, The Triumph of Polarized Partisanship in 2016, Donald Trump's Improbable Victory. He starts out by giving all the reasons Trump shouldn't have won, and then four important reasons of how he did, none of which had anything to do with foreign influence. Now, the second is, it is certainly better for the United States to cooperate with Russia to reach common goals than to compete over unessential ones. Third, the only near-term existential issue for the United States is posed by nuclear weapons. And this is one that can be solved only by US, Russian, and increasingly Chinese cooperation. Now, efforts to block improved relations with Russia often come from those who wish to justify a bloated military-industrial complex. Well, when you think about it, you know, you really don't need carrier task forces or supersonic bombers to deal with terrorism. In fact, to deal with any real threat to the continental United States. You need enemies, and they need to be big countries. Therefore, somehow you've got to find a way to make Russia and China enemies. And we're seeing both processes, I think, coming up. And the probably unconscious of that motivation in many cases. So often you will find, particularly in Congress, the call to keep increasing our defense budget when we should be cutting back on it on the threat of Russia or the growing threat of China. I think that is simply the wrong direction to go. Now, Trump's expressed attitude toward Russia may be the only important issue in which he and not his critics were right. That's another thing. As I would say at the time, you know, I don't agree with many of the things, almost any of the other things that Trump said during the election. In addition, of course, he has turned out to be very contradictory and often saying one thing and then doing something that in effect is the opposite. But even a stopped clock is going to be right twice a day. And for that instant it's right, it is stupid to deny that that's the time. I would put it that way. So the fact that he's wrong about most things doesn't mean that necessarily he's been wrong on that issue. Okay, enough of the circus that has been going on in Washington. Again, I find it so irrational that it's very difficult to talk about it without emotion. But the fact is, it is making it virtually politically impossible for any president in the near future to mend things with Russia, when I think it is clearly in our national interest to do so. But let's look about how we solved things in the past and how we got here. How is it that in just a little over a quarter of a century, we moved from a Europe whole and free into the Cold War, Russia cooperating with us on virtually every important issue that was important to us, and what sounds like a Cold War today, and both countries holding an enemy image of the other? You know, there are undoubtedly a lot of reasons for that. I'm not one who thinks that important things are simply determined by one issue. Whether we talk about the end of the Cold War or the breakup of the Soviet Union or the end of communist control of the Soviet Union, there were a lot more than a single issue involved. But one thing that I think has greatly influenced the development of the current hostility toward Russia is a failure to understand how we ended the Cold War and the significance of that. Now, there are myths there. One of them is that the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, CNN put on I think it was a 4-part series on the Cold War, and it ended with the hammer and sickle coming down in the Kremlin and the Russian tricolor going up. No, that was not the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended well before that happened. The second one is that Western pressure, military and economic, defeated communism. Also wrong. It was Mikhail Gorbachev paradoxically perhaps, and unexpectedly for many, as the leader of the Communist Party who systematically took it out of total control of the country. This was something I don't think anybody would have predicted he could do, but it was, in effect, what he did. The third myth was that the Cold War, for a while, was talked about, well, that was World War III, and now we've got a war on terror, which is World War IV. No way. The first two world wars were nothing like the Cold War. And what we call the war on terror is also nothing like any of the real wars, or for that matter, the Cold War. You know, it is a real mistake to consider a metaphorical war, war on drugs, war on poverty, whatever, as somehow comparable to real war. Confuses people, I think, and it's really too bad that we use that terminology. And then we get to the idea that Russia was defeated in the Cold War. Well, that's also nonsense. The Russian Federation was not an independent entity during the Cold War. It was not a sovereign state. And as a matter of fact, its elected leaders on many issues supported us when the Soviet government didn't. Boris Yeltsin, for example, publicly demanded that ethnic Russian troops not be used in the Baltic in 1991 when there were attacks on television towers and so on. So that actually, as was still a non-sovereign government, once Yeltsin was elected, he more often sided with us than his own government. So to say that Russia was defeated is an absurdity. Now, does any of this really matter? Is it just a matter of historians arguing over causes? Well, I think in this case, it's more than that. After all, if the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and if the Soviet Union was brought down by military or economic pressure, then this was a case of forced regime change, which brought about a new world. Of course, it wasn't. That simply wasn't. And if you look at what actually happened, we negotiated it into the Cold War because we did not go for regime change. When we were preparing our negotiations with the Soviet Union, preparing to negotiate, I was able to get agreement from President Reagan and Secretary of State Schultz, and actually put it out to the bureaucracy that we were not going to question the legitimacy of the Soviet government. Also, we were not going for military superiority. In other words, we were trying to change Soviet behavior, not the system itself. Bad and dysfunction as it was, that was a matter for the Soviet people, not for us. Then the number two is that we defeated communism with our pressure. Actually, the opposite is true. When the pressure from the outside was removed, it gave Gorbachev the opportunity to start trying to reform. He couldn't have done that if the arms race had continued. He couldn't have had those internal reforms if he hadn't. So far from pressuring him to end communism, by relieving the pressure on the outside, the fissures within the communist system began to push it apart. And then, well, again, the myth three about the world wars and Cold Wars, again, it is simply irrelevant because the Cold War was not a war. It wasn't like World War I or II. We would not have survived if the Cold War had been a real war. So and the idea that somehow you solve anything by war, hot or cold, begins to look questionable. And of course, Russia was not defeated in the Cold War. But the idea that it was, And the whole triumphalism, we won the Cold War, you guys lost, now shape up and do things like we say, that in effect has infused our policy ever since the end of the Cold War, starting with the Clinton administration, as I'll point out. Well, you know, this idea, as I said, nourishes the idea that Russia as a defeated nation is not really qualified to be part of what we would call the West. Now, when we say we won the Cold War, sure, that's a half-truth. If it had occurred, we wouldn't be here. But they won too. Everybody won. Avoiding a war, in this case, that would have destroyed you, is winning. So everybody won. But that the West was triumphant is wrong, because it was a victory for all of us. We brought about that by negotiations, not by pressure, but by negotiations. And as I said, these agreements were win-win agreements. They were not agreements that required one side to compromise its true interests. So, in effect, the Cold War was nothing like a win in a military sense or in a sporting sense, but a matter of negotiating with both sides to reach a common satisfactory end. So it was negotiations that brought the Cold War to an end, and the Cold War most likely would not have ended if the United States had insisted on regime change rather than a change of behavior. Now, when we look at our policy with countries since the end of the Cold War, we need to bear that in mind. Now, again, looking back at that period, it seemed to me, as I began to analyze it, that the period of the late 1980s and very early 1990s, a period of 3 to 4 years, brought about 3 such significant shifts in geopolitics that they could be called, I think, seismic, comparable to continent splitting or colliding. First of all, the Cold War ended. Now, we could argue a little bit when it was over. I think it was over ideologically December 7, 1988, when Gorbachev made a speech at the United Nations, which totally discarded the Marxist-Leninist class struggle as a basis of foreign policy and stated that there should be freedom of choice for the countries in Eastern Europe. Now, he proved it in 1989 when the East European countries went democratic without Soviet interference. The Berlin Wall came down and so on. So in 1988, ideologically, it was over. It was confirmed by 89, December 89, it was very clear that confirmed the Cold War was over. But then the Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union, and it did that gradually but very rapidly. Not because they were losing the Cold War, but because Gorbachev was trying to build a more representative regime, importing many more ideas from the West, including ideas of democratization, ideas of competitive elections, and so on. Now, he did this and was able to do it using the discipline of that the Communist Party leader could use that was built into the system. But as he began to change things fundamentally, there developed more and more opposition from the entrenched interest, which included much of the party apparat. Now, when that opposition came, Gorbachev, unlike most leaders, chose to do what he thought was in his country's interest and not what was in his personal interest, as you might say, staying in power of an authoritarian regime. And step by step, he hampered the party from total control. That's a process. It took me nearly 700 pages to describe it in one of my books, but it is very clear to me that it was Gorbachev who destroyed the communist system in the Soviet Union, not Western pressure, but he was able to do it because that Western pressure had started. And then in December '91, the Soviet Union shattered into 15 independent states. Now, this was something that the United States didn't want to happen. Actually, President Bush was trying to assist Gorbachev to hold the Soviet Union together as a voluntary federation, a democratizing voluntary federation of all but the 3 Baltic countries. We thought all along that their independence should be restored, but the others we would be very happy to have in a voluntary union. Bush's meetings with Yeltsin then were trying to convince him to cooperate with Gorbachev not to tear the country apart. Now, we had a number of reasons for that. For Washington, the most important reason is we didn't want to see many more nuclear powers develop. If at one point there were nuclear weapons in virtually every Soviet republic. As it turned out, they had concentrated them in just 4 before it broke up. But for those of us who were watching things on the scene, we felt that Gorbachev was pushing democratization, that he was getting pushback from the Communist Party in most of the republics except the Baltic republics, and that if the Soviet Union suddenly fell apart, that most of it would go back to authoritarian systems by the old communist leaders simply taking over everything. I think I have trouble keeping this on. So the fact is that when President Bush went to Kiev to make a speech to the Verkhovna Rada, the legislature in Ukraine, he made a speech that we would tell the press on background, this is for all the non-Russian republics. He endorsed Gorbachev's Union Treaty. He warned against suicidal nationalism, and he said freedom and independence are not synonymous. Choose freedom. And at that point, in most of the Soviet Union, not in the Baltic countries to be sure, not in Georgia, but in most, Gorbachev was moving democracy against the wishes of the local party leaders. So for democracy in the country as a whole, the breakup of the Soviet Union was a step back. And so see. Well, as I pointed out there, these 3 things happened for different reasons and with different levels of U.S. and Western involvement. Now, I'll go quickly through Reagan's framework for negotiation, but it's interesting when we think about the problems now about what they were then. First, he developed, even before Gorbachev came to office as General Secretary, a 4-part agenda of things we would aim to do. One was to reduce arms, particularly nuclear weapons, with a goal of 0 for nuclear weapons, to end participation in conflict in third countries, to cooperate for better respect for human rights, and to improve the working relationship. This was actually a phrase I suggested because I said, you know, when you say bring down the Iron Curtain, that seems invidious. Let's make it cooperative. Let's cooperate to have a better working relationship. And obviously that means more contacts. That means bringing down the Iron Curtain. But you don't call it that. You talk about improving things. And as a matter of fact, that speech, which was given January 16, 1984, that is nearly 2 years before Reagan actually met Gorbachev, had the word cooperation, I think, more than 30 times in it. When we were writing it, I didn't count it. Since then, a scholar has written a book about it, and in fact said she called it the Great Reagan Turn, was how the rhetoric went from talking about the evils of communism to talking about cooperation. That was real because we based every aim not on you've got to do something, but we must do something in our mutual interest. Now, what, as I mentioned before, was not on our agenda was challenging the legitimacy of the Soviet system. In other words, no attempt to change the system, no regime change, no military superiority, and there was no idea that we were going to force the collapse of the Soviet system. Yes, we wanted to encourage more democracy because we thought if the people had more information about, you know, the arms race and so on, they wouldn't support this growing arms race, and because it was costing them much more than us. But at the same time, we had no idea that we were going to. Now, Gorbachev's response was actually to respond to these things pretty rapidly, given the severity of the things. In their first meeting, they significantly agreed to a considerable expansion of our unofficial exchanges, educational, sports, and so on. For the first time, he agreed to the fact that we would have exchanges of undergraduates and even high school students, and we would allow homestays. Up until the Gorbachev time, in our earlier exchange agreement, it was only graduate students and nothing like, you know, the younger people coming in. But the statement that nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, and therefore there could be no war between us, turned out to be a crucially important one. And it was important to us because before, the Soviet leaders had always insisted, well, you must agree to peaceful coexistence. Well, just those two words sound fine, except that when you looked at the Soviet definition of them, it was peaceful coexistence between countries of different social systems. In other words, it left them the right to intervene in what they call socialist countries. It was okay to invade Czechoslovakia or Hungary because you were supporting socialism. It was only with the capitalist world, because of nuclear weapons, it had to be peaceful. We said, we can't buy on to that. But let's just make this flat statement, and Gorbachev agreed to it. It's the first time any Soviet leader had agreed to a clear, I would say, non-ideological statement of that fact. That was important. Now, in Reykjavik, that meeting that came in October '86, we got very close to an agreement to eliminate nuclear weapons in 10 years. I've written extensively about that in various times. I don't have time to describe it now, except to say that I think in the case of both Gorbachev and Reagan, for the first time in our history, and maybe for the only time in our history, we had two leaders who really thought the world should eliminate nuclear weapons, and they were going to do all they could to see that it happened. We haven't had that leadership since then. However, even then, there was not much progress regarding regional conflicts or human rights. But look at what happened between 1988 and 2008. The blue countries are the EU, and the red, of course, is the Soviet Union, the pink, the countries of Eastern Europe. You can see that by 2008, the EU, and in most cases the EU and NATO were coterminous. There are a few exceptions there. Norway is in NATO, but not the EU, for example. But you can see the massive shift in the geopolitical picture. Now, very quickly here, with the second geopolitical transformation, as I said, this was a case of the CPSU losing control of the USSR, and when there was an attempt by to reverse this, of course, it failed. I've listed here some of the roads to that. The attempted coup d'etat in August 91 failed in just 3 days, and then the Soviet Union broke up on December 25th, 1991. Again, I've listed here some of those steps, but the point here is that this happened for internal reasons, not as a result of Western pressure. So immediately we began to say, or people began to say, well, there were two superpowers before, now there's only one. Now, what do we mean by superpower? We still seem to have that sort of idea. Well, it means you got unlimited power to destroy. That's true. But if it's that, then isn't Russia still a superpower? Did either the US or the Soviet Union have the power to transform other societies using that power they had? No. I mean, there were times toward the end of the Cold War we would have settled the whole Middle East crisis between Israel and the Palestinians. We both wanted to. We couldn't. And so when you're talking about power, you really have to begin to say, well, power for what? And destructive power is not necessarily constructive power. And the fact is that we sort of got the idea that, okay, we're the sole remaining superpower, and therefore we can do what we damn well please, and we've got the power to transform other societies. We've proved that democracy of our type is best for the world. After all, we survived and the Soviet Union didn't. But, you know, that is an illogical statement. A system that is good for us is not necessarily the one that's going to work for other people. Nor is it possible really for one person or for one country or one society to define for another society its government and way of living. One way to put it, if democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people, how can any outsider do it for anybody else? And the answer is they can't. There's only, I think, one effective way to spread democracy in the world, and that is to show how it works at home. And our efforts to make the spread of democracy an integral part of our foreign policy and include in that not only interference in other elections or selections of leaders, removal of leaders, has occurred at precisely the time where most of us would feel that our own democracy has suffered. We have now twice installed presidents who got fewer votes than their opponents. Is that what we want others to emulate? Well, let's get back to the Clinton administration. They had some real achievements, but they also missed opportunities. Because that administration began, we had a Europe whole and free, We had a Russia eager to cooperate with us, in other words. But in the 90s, there seemed to be no strategy for building a different structure, a structure that would, in the case of Europe, include Russia. Because you were not going to have a Europe whole and free if you excluded part of it, and particularly one of the largest part of it. Now, so arms reduction stalled. We had no new reduction agreements then. Imports of oil grew unchecked. There was no peace in the Middle East, even though the Oslo Accords gave us the opening until the very end of the Clinton administration. There was no real effort to push a settlement, and then it was too late. NATO expansion left Russia out of European security, a fundamental, I think, error. And then there was war against Serbia without UN Security Council approval, clearly illegal. We let NATO, a military alliance, serve as the validator of the war. We would never, I think, have approved any other military alliance initiating a war which did not meet the Security Council approval. So now when we accuse Russia of illegally intervening in Ukraine, and they have illegally intervened into Ukraine, the Russians would say, look, you guys started attacking other countries without UN approval and changing borders when you made war against Serbia and detached Kosovo from them without Serbia's approval. And in general, you know, we didn't really change our defense posture. During the Cold War, we had been flying regular patrols right close along the borders of the Soviet Union, of China. We continued all of that, except now it was along Russia's borders, around China's borders. How would we have felt, you know, if China in the Pacific or Russia in the Atlantic was constantly patrolling our borders with listening devices? It's not a very friendly thing to do when you don't really have any problems between them. You'd say, well, why do we do it? Well, we had developed that capability during the Cold War, and nobody thought to shut it off. It was partly, I think, just, you might say, bureaucratic inertia. There were, as I've mentioned, there were missed opportunities. We were unable, even though at this point we had Russia's full support and Europe's support to encourage peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And in dealing with Russia, it often seemed to Russia that Clinton was simply taking advantage of Boris Yeltsin, who did have a problem with alcohol use from time to time and was in extremely poor health in those last few years of his presidency. Characteristic of that, by the way, was the fact that as we were at one point promoting the Partnership for Peace with the countries in Eastern Europe as an alternative, one might say, to NATO membership, Clinton told Yeltsin, this is a substitute for NATO membership. And Yeltsin said, that's brilliant, that's great, because each country was going to be able to have the sort of military relationship and cooperation with NATO that they wished. At the very same time, he was telling that to Yeltsin, the State Department instructed our ambassador in Warsaw to tell the Poles, this is the road to NATO expansion. So regarding Russia, the Clinton administration really, in many ways, played a double game. Now, if Clinton missed opportunities, George W. Bush destroyed them. He was really asleep at the switch when al-Qaeda attacked. I'm one who believes that that attack could have been averted and would have been averted with any president and national security advisor I worked for. We attacked Iraq without UN Security Council approval or solid allied support, and against the specific protests of not only Russia, but also Britain and France. You want to talk about illegal aggression? Well, you certainly got it there. We walked away from important treaties with treaties that had really been at the basis of much of our ending the arms race with the Soviet Union, particularly the ABM Treaty, even though Vladimir Putin offered to amend it to allow us to develop missile defenses as we wished. In fact, I think he would have jumped at the idea of a cooperative program, something that if Gorbachev had been willing to propose, Reagan probably almost certainly would have accepted. We dropped the verification of nuclear reductions in our negotiations at the time. We proclaimed, in effect, an intent to dominate the world. As a matter of fact, we should remember that in sort of the middle of the Bush administration, our Space Command issued officially their policy of maintaining overwhelming domination of space. Dominance. In other words, we're going to have a monopoly on space. Well, we've heard about some of the results of that in our Sid Hacker's lecture. I mean, you know, I think monopolies are bad for everybody, including the monopolist. And in effect, what we were doing in the Bush administration was in effect claiming a monopoly on the right to use force in the world. And obviously, this is going to bring all sorts of blowback. Of course, one thing Clinton did have, which I think was good, was a budgetary surplus. That was turned into a deficit, which we still haven't really tamed. And of course, we had the financial and real estate boom and bust in 2008, and which affected the whole world and still has its effect. He made us the world's largest debtor, and we still are. By 2006, the majority of people in many countries considered the United States the greatest threat to them. Now, you know, Russia then gradually began to be a problem. I don't have time now to go through these various steps, except that I will say that when finally Putin, who started out clearly with the intent of being our partner, at least in dealing with terrorism, and in other respects, his goal was to bring Russia into Europe, though he knew it would take time. He felt that he was being not only turned away, but in many ways belittled all along. And in 2007, he made a speech in Munich where he listed his complaints. He's been very upfront about them. Now, I teach a course at Duke on U.S.-Russian relations during this period, and one of my assignments of the students is to look at that speech and, in hindsight, say, you know, were these complaints justified or not? Were there things that we really had to do, even though Russia didn't like them, or are there things that we really could have done differently without damage to our interests or Russia's? I would say nearly 90% of them, in effect, say, you know, basically he was right. I think when we look back and really examine. So when we talk about his going rogue, in effect, he's been very upfront about the things that disturb him. And although some of them are fait accompli, in the sense you're not going to go back and change them, countries in Eastern Europe are in NATO, and they're going to continue to be, at least for some time. But the fact is that the ways you could have stopped threatening to continue expanding, and that we didn't do. Now, at first, the Obama administration seemed to be very interested in reversing this. And of course, in his first term, and initially, he did a tremendous amount to restore respect for the United States in the world. He got a Nobel Peace Prize early on, and everybody was relieved that we had a president different from George W. Bush, or at least nearly everybody. In fact, and with Russia, the New START Treaty was very important in restoring further reductions in nuclear weapons and preserving verification. The George W. Bush administration seemed willing to simply do away with verification, thinking that we could go it alone and simply do anything we pleased to. But a lot of problems remained. Problems about missile defense. We can talk about this later. Syria, of course, has become a tremendous new problem. And again, the problem there is much more complicated than one can discuss about simply. But I would say here, I thought the United States started off with the wrong policy, focusing on removing Assad rather than doing what we could to minimize violence in the country. There was no reasonable reason to think that moderates could remove Assad and remain control of the country. Everything we should have learned in Iraq and in Libya would have told us if Assad goes, ISIS is probably going to be the dominant factor there. And yet, instead of thinking about how this very complicated situation where many other actors are more important than we are, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, Qatar, you name it. And of course, the idea that Russia would stay out because it had no legitimate interest there was absolutely crazy. Anyway, we can talk about that more if you wish. The other problem, Ukraine, just briefly, I'm sure the specialists here are aware of many of these things, but in terms of American politics, in 2014, when this crisis suddenly broke, the Washington Post had a poll and found that only 1 in 6 Americans knew where Ukraine was. And yet you had, at that point, a majority of, a slight majority who thought that we should intervene. But the fact is that Ukraine was a deeply divided country, in part because it had been, those borders had been constructed in fairly recent history. You can see here the dates in which, and only the green part had been historically part of the Russian Empire for more than 1 century, whereas the western parts were added in effect after World War II, and the Crimea as recently as '54 by simply the stroke of a pen. More important, the country was divided in its electoral presence. This is one election. Almost every election they had the same pattern. In the West, 90% more or less for one candidate. In the East and South, 90% more or less for the other. And yet they had a unitary constitution which allowed whoever won that presidential election, even if it was 50% plus 1 vote, name every one of the provincial governors. That, of course, is a prescription for disaster. Now, I think that the US and the EU involvement in Ukraine and the fact that we were unwilling to make a commitment not to bring Ukraine into NATO. In fact, in 2008, back during the Bush administration, There was actually a statement by NATO that eventually Georgia and Ukraine would become members. Now, one of Russia's most important naval bases is at Sevastopol, and I think President Putin made very clear that one of the reasons he felt it was necessary to remove the possibility of Crimea becoming part of NATO was that he didn't want to lose that naval base. Now, the confrontations we have had over Ukraine and Syria are not comparable to the Cold War. They are not tremendous ideological things, but they are dangerous because it has led us step by step to an assumption on both sides that we are enemies. I've been recently, when I've been visiting Russia, once I went on a taxi to the airport. I have a Russian daughter-in-law. She was there talking to the taxi driver. He didn't know that we were Americans, and he started railing about how the United States had inveigled them into coming into Syria. They were blaming us for their going to Syria, which he didn't like, and so on. The idea being, well, the Americans are behind all of our problems. And of course, when we put sanctions on things, and when President Obama brags that he is costing President Putin because of his actions in Ukraine, I have to roll my eyes. One thing, why is he saying this publicly? That's not going to achieve you anything. But second, it's not true. He wasn't costing Putin anything. He was costing the Russian people. And the Russian people then were blaming many of their economic difficulties, most of which were created either by the system or by low oil prices with the sanctions. They were achieving no real goal, and yet this is something that Congress loves to do and is trying to continue doing. But the fact is that basically Russia's basic interests are completely consistent with ours. And the greatest interest, of course, is dealing with nuclear weapons. First of all, making sure they're not used, dealing with the safety of the materials, dealing with non-proliferation issues. But even the other big world issues of global warming and so on, we're not going to solve them without cooperation from Russia. And when we begin to try to define where their interests are in their own region, then we're going to get pushback, and we're going to get much less willingness on their part to do what actually is in the interests of both countries. I think here, and this is something we could talk about at some length, we have to think about some of the psychological issues. Those of you who have studied international relations theory are aware that most theories deal with countries as if they are coherent entities. And some realists even talk about countries being like billiard balls. I think this is a great mistake. International relations is about the interaction of people. And as Dr. Hecker was pointing out this morning, how important the psychology of the North Korean leaders are in dealing with them. What they probably crave most of all is respect. And when you don't give them that, you're going to get pushback, and often it can be irrational, and often it can be dangerous. This is, I think, certainly true of President Putin. And when you read so many in our press, it would seem that people can't refer to him without some negative or insulting epithet. Well, I'm no partisan of the various policies he's made, and I think some of them, including the policy toward Ukraine, is very damaging to Russia's interests. But I also know that if he can pose that he's doing them to oppose American domination of the world and American pushing them around and trying to cut them off. He's going to get support from a lot of people in Russia. And we achieve absolutely nothing positive through such a policy. So in the final analysis, I think we have to understand that Russia is important. They do have enough nuclear weapons to wipe us out. They have space capabilities, some of which are superior to ours. It was ironic that at one point when President Obama said publicly, you know, Russia is only a regional power. You know, well, gee, regional power? We have to use their rockets to get to the International Space Station. Their ICBMs are hardly regional. And I suspect that their cyber capabilities are pretty well equal to ours. In any event, they probably know what we're doing in the cyber area because they've got Snowden and probably everything that he took out. I just cannot understand why we allowed so much to, you might say, first of all, the demonization of another leader, then an insulting. What was gained by excluding Putin from the Group of Eight? Now, during the Cold War, we were doing our best to bring them to negotiating tables, to bring about a condition in which we could begin to invest in each other's countries and do business, and so on. Now, it would seem that there are people who think that any contact with Russia is somehow treasonous. That's just not rational. Now, the point is that we must deal with Russia on so many of the serious problems, whether it's terrorism or failed states, environmental degradation, organized crime, disease control, all of these international issues. We're not going to manage them. Russia is either going to be part of the problem or part of the solution. And surely it's in our interest to do all we can to make them part of the solution. So just to conclude with where I started, why is it, assuming that, yes, President Putin ordered a hacking of the DNC emails, what was he trying to do? Was he trying to elect Trump? No. He didn't think Trump could be elected any more than we did. But he wanted to send a message to Secretary Clinton, assuming she would be elected. Take us seriously, damn it. Stop talking about only a regional power. And by the way, don't forget Ukraine is in our region. Thanks very much.